So there's this quote, the life of the flesh is in the blood.
Right.
And that is actually a direct quote from the book of Leviticus, chapter 17, verse 11.
Yeah, that's the exact one.
And it's this incredibly ancient text, I mean, thousands of years old. But I want to ask you, the listener, a question right out of the gate for today's deep dive. Have you ever actually stopped to consider how a single fluid, I mean, literally the fluid pulsing through your veins right now as you listen to this, how it has completely captivated both modern molecular science and ancient theology for millennia?
It's a profound paradox to think about, really, because we're talking about something so ubiquitous, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Something we frankly try to ignore entirely until we, scrape a knee or get a paper cut. Yet it is the absolute epicenter of human existence. It's this bizarrely fragile, yet somehow overwhelmingly resilient mechanism that literally keeps us tethered to the physical world.
And that is exactly what we are exploring today. We're going to unpack this fascinating piece of work by Ozair de Silva Mota. It's from his book, Analysis Biblico-Scientificos, which translates to Biblical Scientific Analysis.
Right. And the goal here isn't just to do a basic biology lesson on blood.
No, not at all. We're going to explore how the deeply intricate, mechanical biological functions of blood and its importance for homeostasis perfectly mirror its immense biblical symbolism.
Yeah, we're talking about blood as the ultimate representation of physical life, of redemptive sacrifice, and of course, spiritual communion.
Because the dual nature of this exploration is really what makes it so compelling. If we were just doing a breakdown of plasma and hemoglobin, maintaining internal balance, that would be interesting, sure.
Oh, definitely. And if we were just doing a theological exploration of the cross and redemptive sacrifice, that would be profound on its own.
Right, but we are looking at the synthesis of the two. We're going to look at how the physical, microscopic realities of our vascular system, like the actual hard chemistry of it, help us understand the vast, abstract concepts of human compassion and spiritual redemption.
So let's actually look under the hood of this fluid then. Because to really understand the philosophy, we have to grasp the hard science first.
Yeah, and the very first thing that caught me totally off guard is the classification. Because blood is not just a liquid. Biologically, it's classified as a highly specialized liquid connective tissue.
Which is such a strange phrase.
It really is, because when I think of a tissue, I think of something solid and structural, like muscle tissue, bone tissue, skin. How on earth is a liquid considered a connective tissue?
Well, it totally breaks our intuitive understanding of the word, doesn't it?
Completely.
But biologically speaking, a tissue is defined by its structure and its origin, not its phase of matter. A connective tissue basically consists of living cells suspended in a non-living matrix.
Okay, right.
So in bone, for example, that matrix is solid calcium phosphate. But in blood, that matrix is a liquid. It's the plasma.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, and because you have living cells, like red and white blood cells suspended in this fluid matrix, it meets the exact structural criteria for a tissue. And functionally, it literally connects the entire body. It is the chemical bridge between your lungs and your toes, your brain and your liver.
And it is doing this continuously, which is wild. Like, the average adult has about 4.5 to 6 liters of this tissue in constant circulation. That is roughly 7 to 8% of your entire body weight.
It's a massive amount of volume when you really picture it.
It is. And it operates at a surprisingly warm, constant temperature of roughly 38 degrees Celsius. But here's the physics detail that I really want to drill into.
Okay, lay it on me.
Blood is 4 to 5 times more viscous or thicker than water.
Yes, it is.
That just sounds incredibly inefficient to me. Why would the body want a fluid that is harder to pump? Like, wouldn't a thinner fluid be easier on the heart?
It sounds totally counterintuitive, right? Until you look at the actual mechanics of the cardiovascular system. Viscosity is essentially the measure of a fluid's resistance to flow.
Right.
That thickness isn't a design flaw. It is a strict mechanical necessity. You have to think about the concept of vascular resistance.
Okay.
If your blood were as thin as water, it would flow with very little friction against the walls of your arteries. Your heart would pump, and the fluid would just shoot through the system without building up any pressure whatsoever.
Wait, so the friction is actually the point.
Absolutely. The viscosity creates this necessary shear stress. When your left ventricle contracts, it has to push against a fluid that actively resists moving.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that resistance is exactly what creates and maintains your blood pressure. Without that pressure, the fluid just couldn't travel upwards against gravity to perfuse your brain. You'd pass out instantly.
That makes so much sense.
It's basically Koizumi law in action.
Hmm.
The pressure drop across a vessel is directly proportional to the fluid's viscosity. So that's specific 4 to 5 times thicker than water metric. It's the exact mathematical sweet spot required to maintain structural pressure.
Without, like, overworking the heart muscle to the point of failure.
Exactly. It's perfectly balanced.
That is just fascinating. So the difficulty is literally the mechanism.
Precisely.
So if we break down what is actually making up that volume, it's divided into two main components. First, you have the plasma, which is the fluid matrix you mentioned earlier.
Right, the liquid part.
And that makes up about 55 to 60% of the total volume. And 90% of that plasma is just water, which, makes sense. But it's the remaining 10% of the plasma that seems to be doing an absurd amount of heavy lifting for our homeostasis.
Oh, that 10% is an absolute biochemical marvel. I mean, you have glucose, hormones, electrolytes, so your sodium, potassium, calcium, along with dissolved gases and metabolic waste products like urea. But the real heavy hitters in that 10% are the plasma proteins, specifically albumin, globulins, and fibrinogen.
Well, I want to push back on something here just for clarity.
Sure, go ahead.
Because if plasma is 90% water, how are lipid-based hormones, which are basically fats and therefore naturally repel water, how are they traveling through this fluid without separating out, like oil and vinegar in a salad dressing?
That is exactly where those plasma proteins come into play.
Really?
Yeah, they aren't just floating around aimlessly. They're active biological machines. Many of them act as transport proteins. They physically bind to those hydrophobic, water-fearing lipid molecules and basically encapsulate them.
So they wrap them up.
Exactly. They effectively give them a water-soluble disguise so they can travel safely through the watery plasma without clumping together and causing, a fatal embolism.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy just to make sure we've got it. If the human body is a massive, bustling metropolis, the plasma is the actual highway infrastructure. It's the water flowing through the canals.
I like that, yeah.
And the formed elements, the red and white blood cells, those are the specialized vehicles. The delivery trucks bringing oxygen, the garbage trucks removing carbon dioxide, and the police cruisers hunting down invaders.
Right, and those transport proteins.
They are essentially molecular taxicab.
Precisely. You nailed it. And albumin, which is the most abundant plasma protein, does something even more crucial than that. It maintains what we call oncotic pressure.
Okay, let's unpack oncotic pressure because this gets to the how of the system's balance. I've always heard that phrase thrown around in medical dramas, but what is the actual mechanism there?
It all comes down to osmosis. Water inherently always wants to move from an area of low solute concentration to an area of high solute concentration. It desperately wants to dilute the heavily concentrated area.
Right, basic high school biology stuff.
Exactly. So as your blood flows through your tiny capillary beds, the hydrostatic pressure, which is the physical pumping force of the heart, is actually pushing water out of the blood vessels and into your surrounding tissues.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so if left unchecked, all your fluid would just leak into your tissues. You'd have massive swelling, and your blood pressure would just plummet to zero.
So the body somehow has to pull the water back in.
Yes, and albumin is a massive, bulky protein. It's simply too large to leak out through those tiny capillary walls. So as the water gets pushed out by the heart's pumping, the concentration of albumin remaining inside the vessel becomes very, very high.
Ah, because the water left, but the protein stayed.
Exactly. This creates a powerful osmotic pull, and that is the oncotic pressure. The massive albumin proteins literally drag the water molecules back into the bloodstream, maintaining your blood volume minute by minute.
That is incredible. So the plasma is this highly managed, dynamic chemical environment, perfectly maintaining our internal balance.
Right.
But then we have the second major component of blood, the formed elements, which make up the other 40 to 45%.
The cells, yeah.
Right. These are the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. But honestly, even with my highway analogy earlier, I want to move away from the cliche comparisons here. We always hear red blood cells called delivery trucks and white blood cells called police cruisers. But that feels way too simplistic for what is actually happening chemically, right?
Oh, it is entirely too simplistic.
Yeah.
It implies this conscious, central decision-making process. Like there's a tiny dispatcher in your brain telling a truck where to go.
Exactly, like they have little GPS units.
Right. But the cardiovascular system operates more like a highly reactive, decentralized network of chemical logic gates. The cells don't know where to go at all. They just react to localized thermodynamic and chemical triggers.
Give me an example of that. Let's look at the erythrocytes, the red blood cells. Their sole purpose is to carry oxygen, which they do using a protein complex called hemoglobin. Now, I know hemoglobin uses iron to bind to oxygen, and that is what makes blood red. But how does it actually know when to pick up oxygen in the lungs and when to drop it off in, say, my calf muscle when I'm out for a run?
That is a brilliant piece of molecular engineering called the Bohr effect, and it relies entirely on the physical shape of the hemoglobin protein.
Okay, the shape.
Yeah. Hemoglobin contains an iron-based structure called a heme group. When hemoglobin is in your lungs, the pH is relatively high and oxygen is very plentiful. This environment causes the protein to adopt what we call a relaxed or R state.
So it physically relaxes?
Exactly. In this shape, the iron atom is perfectly positioned to bind tightly to oxygen. And when it binds, the actual physical structure of the entire molecule shifts slightly, which changes the way it absorbs light.
Oh, and that is why fully oxygenated arterial blood turns that bright, vivid red.
Yes, exactly.
But then, okay, it travels all the way down to my running calf muscle. What triggers the release if there's no central command?
Well, when your calf muscle is working hard, it produces carbon dioxide and lactic acid.
Right, the burn.
Exactly. That localized production of acid drops the pH of the blood in that specific area.
Yeah.
When the hemoglobin molecule hits that new acidic environment, the chemical bonds shift. The protein literally changes its physical shape again, twisting into a tense or T state.
Whoa.
Yeah, and this shape change physically ejects the oxygen molecule right where it is needed most. It doesn't decide to drop it off. The localized acidic environment literally forces the molecular lock open.
That's why.
And once it drops the oxygen, the color shifts to that darker, deeper red we see in venous blood.
So it's a completely automated thermodynamic response. That makes the system seem even more complex, to be honest, because it relies on thousands of localized microenvironments perfectly tuning themselves.
It really is a marvel.
And speaking of complex systems, there is a highly speculative point in the source text that I found totally mesmerizing. The author points out that despite all of our modern medical advancements, we can sequence the human genome, we can transplant hearts. We are literally printing 3D tissue now.
Oh, science has come incredibly far.
Right. But science still has not created a complete, viable artificial substitute for human blood. Why is that? Why is this specific fluid so impossible to reverse engineer?
Simply because it is the ultimate multitasker, and we just do not possess the engineering capability to replicate it. We can create volume expanders, like saline, to keep blood pressure up in an emergency.
Right, see IV bags all the time.
Yeah, and we have even experimented with perfluorocarbons to carry oxygen. But we cannot synthesize a single fluid that does everything at once. Think about the platelets and the coagulation cascade. We haven't even touched on that yet.
Oh, let's touch on it. The coagulation cascade, because that has to do with protection. Right?
This is perhaps the greatest example of why we can't build artificial blood. Your blood has to remain perfectly liquid while inside an intact vessel. But the absolute millisecond a vessel is breached, it has to instantly transform into a solid plug to stop you from bleeding to death.
Yeah, if we were designing a pipe system for a house, we would just put a patch on the outside of the pipe.
Exactly. But the body builds the patch from the fluid inside the pipe.
How is that even possible?
It's an explosive amplification process. When a blood vessel tears, it exposes a protein called tissue factor to the blood. This triggers a localized, cascading series of chemical reactions.
It's like a domino effect.
Very much so. Factor X activates, which converts a protein called prothrombin into an active enzyme called thrombin. Thrombin then acts like microscopic scissors, cleaving a soluble plasma protein called fibrinogen into these insoluble, sticky threads of fibrin.
Wow. Okay.
And these fibrin threads weave together in a fraction of a second, creating a massive net that traps red blood cells and platelets, forming a solid clot.
It's a domino effect, but with an amplification factor. Like one fallen domino knocks over 10, which then knock over 100.
Exactly. But here is the real rub. It has to be perfectly regulated. If the cascade doesn't shut itself down immediately once the hole is plugged, that clot will just keep growing until it blocks the entire blood vessel.
Which would cause a fatal thrombosis, right? Like a heart attack or a stroke.
Yes. Human engineers simply do not know how to design a fluid that can execute an explosive, life-saving chain reaction and then instantly suppress that exact same reaction just a millimeter away.
Yeah.
The sheer localized intelligence of human blood is staggering.
Which brings us to a really crucial realization for the listener. We are entirely dependent on this system working with microscopic perfection every single second of our lives.
Yes, we are.
All of these moving parts we just talked about, the plasma, the transport proteins, the shape-shifting hemoglobin, the explosive clotting cascades, they are all working in a desperate, continuous ballet to achieve one overarching goal. They are fighting to maintain homeostasis.
The absolute core of biological survival.
Exactly. And the source text essentially paints homeostasis as the razor's edge of physical life.
Well, homeostasis is the biological definition of internal balance. The source text divides the overarching functions of blood into three main axes to achieve this balance: transport, protection, and regulation.
Okay, so we've covered the transport axis with oxygen and the lipid hormones, and we just covered the protection axis with the immune system and that crazy coagulation cascade. But I want to zero in on the regulation axis now.
The fine-tuning.
Yeah. The text highlights blood's role in maintaining thermal stability and electrolyte balance, but it places a massive, massive emphasis on the acid-base balance. The pH of human blood is strictly controlled between 7.35 and 7.45. It is slightly alkaline.
Yes, and that incredibly narrow window is completely non-negotiable.
See, here is where it gets really interesting to me, but honestly also kind of terrifying. If you are a listener sitting there right now, maybe drinking a highly acidic soda or a cup of black coffee, your body is frantically working to ensure that acidity doesn't alter your blood pH.
It's working overtime.
Because if our pH shifts just a tiny bit outside of that 7.35 to 7.45 range, say it drops to 7.2 or goes up to 7.6, our metabolic functions just start to fail. Proteins denature, enzymes stop working.
You basically start shutting down.
Right, so I have to ask, why is the human machine designed to be so incredibly fragile? I mean, we can survive freezing temperatures, we can survive starvation for weeks, but a decimal point change in our blood's acidity can kill us in minutes. Doesn't that seem like a massive evolutionary flaw?
I completely understand why it feels that way. From a macro perspective, having your entire existence hinge on a fraction of a pH point sounds like terrible, terrible design.
Right.
But if we connect this to the microscopic reality, it's not a flaw at all. It is the necessary cost of having a highly responsive, incredibly complex system.
Okay, explain that trade-off for me, because I'm not seeing the benefit.
Think about thermodynamics and enzymatic function. The proteins and enzymes that govern our thought processes, our muscle contractions, our cellular respiration, they're unimaginably complex, folded structures.
Like the hemoglobin we talked about.
Exactly. Their ability to function depends entirely on their 3D shape. And that shape is held together by very weak hydrogen bonds. If the environment becomes too acidic, an influx of rogue hydrogen ions will literally rip those weak bonds apart.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, causing the protein to unfold, or denature. It loses its shape, and therefore it completely loses its function.
So the extreme sensitivity is what actually allows us to have high-level cognitive function and complex metabolisms. We are trading, like, brute robustness for high performance.
Precisely. Think of it like this. A tractor is robust. You can put terrible fuel in it, you can beat it up, and it will still run.
Yeah.
But it's slow, and its capabilities are limited.
Okay, I track with that.
But a Formula One car requires absolute precision in its fuel mixture, its temperature, its aerodynamics. If one tiny thing is off by a millimeter, the car fails. The human body is the ultimate high-performance machine. And to manage this required precision, the blood utilizes what the text describes as the bicarbonate buffer system.
How does that actually intercept the acid from, say, my muscles working out or that soda I just drank?
It is a brilliant application of Le Chatelier's chemical principle. Your blood is full of bicarbonate ions. When an acidic substance introduces free hydrogen ions into your blood, those bicarbonate ions act like chemical sponges.
They just soak them up.
They instantly bind to the hydrogen ions, converting them into carbonic acid, which is a very weak, safe acid. Then, an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase instantly breaks that carbonic acid down into water and carbon dioxide.
Oh, wow. So it literally takes a dangerous free-floating acid and chemically converts it into plain water and CO2.
Exactly. But now you have extra CO2 in your blood, right?
Yeah, which you have to get rid of.
So, the respiratory center in your brainstem detects this slight increase in CO2 and signals your lungs. You will unconsciously start to breathe slightly faster or slightly deeper. You're hyperventilating just a tiny amount to blow that excess CO2 out of your mouth.
And I don't even notice I'm doing it.
Never. And at the exact same time, your kidneys are filtering the blood, deciding whether to excrete extra hydrogen into your urine or hold on to more bicarbonate.
Wow.
Your lungs and your kidneys are in this continuous, real-time chemical conversation, completely mediated by the blood. They're adjusting your breathing rate and your urine composition minute by minute just to keep you in that 7.35 to 7.45 window.
It is exhausting just thinking about the math involved in that. We are basically surviving by the skin of our teeth every time we take a breath.
We truly are.
And that profound realization of our physical fragility is exactly where the author of our source text takes the narrative next. Because we have this mathematically perfect buffer system, but what actually happens to the human experience when that exact math fails? We move from the abstract science to the raw, emotional, physical reality of the situation.
Yes. The author grounds all this incredible biology in visceral human experience. They reference the observations of a renowned missionary surgeon named Paul Brand, who treated patients in deep trauma and hypovolemic shock.
And hypovolemic shock is what happens when you lose a massive amount of blood volume, right? Typically more than 20%.
Exactly. And without the volume, you lose the pressure. And without the pressure, you lose the transport of oxygen.
Which collapses the whole system.
Yeah, right. Brand described the physical manifestations of this failure. He noted the profound pallor as the body literally shunts all remaining blood away from the skin to protect the core organs. He noted the fading consciousness as the brain starves for oxygen and the imminent organ failure.
But he also described the absolute miracle of a blood transfusion in those moments.
He did. The instant healthy blood was introduced, restoring the volume, the pressure, and the transport. The shock reversed almost instantaneously. It's like flipping a switch.
And the author then shares a deeply personal, incredibly moving account of his own mother's final 29 days. She was suffering from severe kidney failure. And this connects perfectly to what we just discussed about the buffer system.
It's a tragic but perfect example.
Because her kidneys could no longer perform that crucial filtration. They couldn't excrete the hydrogen or regulate the bicarbonate. Her blood pH began to fail, and toxins began to build up. Her own body became what the author actually calls a hostile environment for life.
It's a very stark, very clinical depiction of homeostasis collapsing. In kidney failure, the kidneys can no longer filter out nitrogenous waste like urea and creatinine.
Right.
As these toxins accumulate in the blood, they eventually start to cross the blood-brain barrier. This leads to a condition called uremic encephalopathy. The author describes the physical signs of this fading a cadaverous gray skin tone as the red blood cell count dropped, a complete loss of physical vigor, and crucially, the fading of mental lucidity. The toxins were literally disrupting the firing of her neurons.
And the author uses a very poetic yet medically devastating phrase here. He describes it as watching the soul slowly withdraw, step by step, as the internal environment became biologically uninhabitable.
The physical hardware is failing, so the software was glitching.
Exactly. But then the medical intervention happens. They administer a transfusion of healthy, balanced blood. And the author notes that the transformation was almost supernatural in its speed.
It wasn't a gradual recovery over days.
No. The flush of life returned to her skin immediately. Because the new blood diluted the toxins and restored oxygen delivery to the brain, her mental confusion vanished into sharp lucidity. Her physical vigor was temporarily, but undeniably, restored.
That visual of life, returning via blood, literally sitting by a hospital bed and watching vitality flow from a plastic bag into a human vein, restoring consciousness in real time, that experience is really the fulcrum of this entire deep dive.
Because it bridges the gap between biology and philosophy. So what did the author take away from that specific moment regarding the relationship between the physical body and the soul?
Well, the author's profound takeaway was that life does not merely inhabit the body as a static resident or like a ghost in a machine. Life flows through it.
It's an active process.
Right. Biologically, the source states, blood doesn't just support life. Blood is the active mechanism of temporal life. This tangible visual proof perfectly explains exactly why ancient texts, written thousands of years before anyone knew what an erythrocyte or a bicarbonate ion was, used blood as the ultimate, non-negotiable metaphor for the soul, for life, and for redemptive sacrifice.
Which brings us to the core of the biblical scientific synthesis. We are finally crossing the bridge from the sterile hospital room, and the chemistry of pH buffers into the ancient scriptures. Let's revisit that hook from the very beginning. Leviticus 17.11. The life of the flesh is in the blood.
the author makes a brilliant contextual point here. He notes that Leviticus is obviously not a physiology textbook.
Right. The ancient Israelites wandering the desert had no concept of plasma proteins, oxygen transport, or oncotic pressure.
Not at all. Yet the text captures the exact biological reality we've just spent all this time dissecting. The ancient theological assertion perfectly aligns with modern scientific confirmation.
And this alignment is crucial for how the source interprets the central defining event of the Christian faith, the symbolism of the cross. The text argues that when the scriptures say Jesus Christ shed his blood, it is not just focusing on the physical violence or the gore of the crucifixion.
No, it means he voluntarily delivered up his own life. The blood is the visible, tangible, undeniable expression of homeostasis being surrendered. It is the life being poured out and offered.
Exactly. The author frames the cross as the ultimate donation of life, the life of the just, freely given for the unjust. Because blood is life, shedding it is the absolute maximum sacrifice possible. You are giving away the very fluid that sustains your temporal existence.
It's the ultimate cost.
But the source text doesn't stop at the mechanics of the sacrifice itself. It moves into how believers interact with that sacrifice, which introduces the deeply complex concept of spiritual communion. And I think this is really where the source text shines.
This is where things get controversial, actually, and we have to look closely at the text. The author brings up the Gospel of John, chapter 6, specifically verse 54. Christ gives this incredibly intense, almost jarring command to his followers to eat my flesh and drink my blood.
Now, I want to pause here and look at the historical context, because to a first-century Jewish audience, hearing this in a synagogue in Capernaum, this would have been profoundly shocking. Right?
Oh, it would have been utterly scandalous.
Yeah.
You have to remember the Levitical law we just quoted. Leviticus 17 strictly prohibited the consumption of blood.
Because the surrounding pagan cultures did that, right?
Yeah, they often drank the blood of sacrificed animals because they believed they were absorbing the animal's life force, its strength, its vitality. The Israelites were strictly forbidden from this practice to set them apart.
To make them distinct.
Exactly. So when Christ stands up and says, "Drink my blood," his followers are horrified. The text literally says many of them walked away and stopped following him right then and there because it was such a hard teaching.
So how does the author of our source text reconcile this? Because he isn't suggesting a biological consumption, obviously.
No, not at all. The author clarifies this using the exact biological framework we've built today. He argues that this command is deeply symbolic and existential. It is not a biological or magical act. It is an act of absolute, all-encompassing faith.
Okay, lay that out for me.
Let's go back to the biology for a second. The physical body must continuously, second by second, receive the circulation of blood to avoid hypovolemic shock, organ failure, and death.
The tissues have to have it.
Right. The tissues must appropriate the oxygen and nutrients.
Right.
In the exact same way, the author argues, the soul must continuously receive and appropriate the life of Christ to avoid spiritual death.
It's an issue of continuous supply. Let me try an analogy here. Think about when you admire a mentor or a profound historical figure so deeply that you actively try to internalize their worldview.
Okay, I follow.
You read their books, you study their decisions, and you want their principles to literally become your principles. You want their mind to shape your mind. But what the source is describing is that concept elevated to a cosmic spiritual scale.
Exactly.
You aren't just remembering a great teacher, you are recognizing that his life, his voluntary sacrifice, is now the actual sustaining source of your own spiritual existence.
That is a very accurate reading of the existential interpretation the author is putting forward. If we look at how the author views the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, it builds perfectly on this idea.
How so?
The text explicitly states that the Eucharist is not a magic ritual where elements physically transform. It is a living memorial. It is the moment where believers identify with the cross, confess their broken state, and actively appropriate Christ's redemptive work.
And the key word there is actively. It is not passive.
Yes. Crucially, the source argues that this consciousness cannot be limited to a periodic ritual on a Sunday morning. It must continuously shape one's entire existence.
Oh, like the buffer system.
Think back to the bicarbonate buffer system. It never stops. It never takes a break. Just as your heart doesn't stop pumping blood between meals, this spiritual appropriation must be as continuous as circulation itself.
Because without physical circulation, the body dies in minutes.
Right. And without continuous communion with that divine life, the author argues, the soul remains dead.
It is a very heavy, philosophically dense concept, but a philosophy that stays in the abstract is ultimately useless. It demands a practical response in the real world.
It has to have legs.
Yeah. If Christ's ultimate sacrifice was the voluntary donation of his life out of pure love, how does the author suggest this massive theological concept should actually manifest in our physical, everyday, mundane actions? Because if we accept this massive paradigm, it has to change how we live.
And that brings us to the ultimate ethical application of the source text. To get to the practical application, the author first addresses a well-known real-world controversy regarding blood, specifically the prohibition against blood transfusions held by Jehovah's Witnesses.
I'm glad we are touching on this because it's a perfect test case for how theology dictates medical ethics. Just so the listener knows, we're simply reporting the text here, but what is the author's stance on this controversy?
Looking impartially at the text, the author fundamentally disagrees with the prohibition. The author argues that the Old Testament prohibition against consuming blood was historically and culturally contextual.
Going back to the pagan cults.
Right. As we discussed earlier, it was about avoiding the pagan cult practices of the surrounding nations who drank blood to absorb power. The prohibition was designed to instill a profound respect for life as something that belongs solely to God.
Okay.
According to the author, the biblical command was never, ever intended to forbid modern, life-saving medical treatments like transfusions.
Because, as the author points out, the absolute central overriding principle of the entire biblical narrative is the preservation of life and the active practice of love. They quote the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verse 13, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends."
Which brings the entire deep dive full circle in a really beautiful way. If donating one's entire life is the absolute maximum expression of love, as demonstrated symbolically and physically on the cross, then the physical act of donating blood to save a dying patient is a very real, very human, tangible reflection of that exact divine principle.
It completely reframes a trip to the blood bank, doesn't it?
It really does.
It elevates it from a mundane medical chore. It's not just checking a box for civic duty or getting a free cookie in a juice box. The author is saying that while we obviously cannot spiritually redeem anyone with our own blood, we can literally preserve their physical life. It is a silent, unseen gesture that directly echoes the cross.
It's an echo sacrifice.
But I have to ask, how does this change the way we view our own bodies? We live in a culture that is fiercely protective of bodily autonomy. The idea of my body, my choice is paramount. How does this theology interact with that?
It shifts the paradigm from ownership to stewardship. The author's logic is that if life is a gift from God, then preserving life, both your own and others, honors the giver. Therefore, your body is not just your own isolated, impenetrable fortress.
So it's not entirely mine to hoard.
Exactly. The physical act of giving a part of your own homeostasis, literally giving away a portion of the fluid that is desperately trying to keep your own pH perfectly balanced, your own albumin that is holding your water weight in to restore the failing toxic homeostasis of a complete stranger.
Wow.
Yeah, that is the ultimate ethical paradigm of the Christian faith, according to the text. It is theology made liquid. It elevates blood donation from a mere medical procedure to a profound expression of practical compassion and a literal imitation of divine sacrifice.
Theology made liquid. That is the phrase that is going to stick with me. We have covered incredible, vast ground today. We started deep in the microscopic, miraculous biology of plasma, proteins, and hemoglobin.
The plumbing of the body, basically.
Yeah, and we marveled at the physics of viscosity and the thermodynamics of a connective tissue that fights, second by second, employing millions of chemical logic dates to maintain our internal balance against impossible odds.
We examine the terrifying fragility of that balance, where a fraction of a decimal point in pH can denature the proteins that allow us to think, meaning the difference between vibrant life and sudden organ failure.
So precarious.
And we saw, through the heartbreaking lens of a mother's final days fighting uremic encephalopathy, how deeply intertwined that biological fluid is with the very essence of human vitality and conscious presence.
And finally, we followed the source as it wove those profound biological truths into the theology of blood as the ultimate symbol of sacrifice, communion, and redemptive love. Biologically, blood is the absolute vehicle of temporal life. But theologically, for the author, the blood of Christ points to the unshakable foundation of eternal life, calling us to mimic that sacrifice in our daily compassion.
As we close this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thing to ponder. Building on the metaphor the author constructed so carefully.
Please do.
We have learned today that without the continuous, unseen, silent circulation of blood within our physical bodies, the organism fails in a matter of minutes. If we take that metaphor one step further out into the broader world, what invisible circulation of compassion, of quiet sacrifice, of donated time and shared humanity is required every single day to keep our communities and perhaps our own souls from fading away into toxic isolation?
A powerful, necessary question to carry with you, because as we've learned today, whether you are looking through an electron microscope at a folding protein or reading an ancient text by candlelight, the truth remains exactly the same. The life of the flesh is undeniably in the blood.